Welcome back. This is the first episode of some kind of book review series that I'm starting. And so I don't read a lot of books, but I read books. And mainly what I read are histories. And usually they're pretty commercial histories, but once in a while I'll read something that, is a little more tough. But I wanted to talk to you today about the first book that I read back in May of 2022, before I realized that I was going to make a series of my book notes. This book was called Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan by John Day, written in 2000. This was a very short book. Maybe it just felt short because I read it so fast, and I usually read very slowly. But it's 8 chapters, and it talks all about the context of Yahweh in the pagan world of Canaan. And that's something that's very interesting to me, so I'll be reading like a series of biblical histories, and in addition to like Mesopotamian and Egyptian histories themselves. So if you end up liking this particular video, then hopefully you'll come back for other stuff later on. So, as I mentioned, I'm really interested in that, the biblical lands and the biblical history of the Abrahamic religions. So I was really interested to see how Yahweh was influenced, and perhaps influenced also the deities and the structures of worship that were in Canaan, kind of in the earliest formations of what became Judaism. So chapter 1 is called Yahweh and El. It's my little and symbol. It looks really ugly. But if you're familiar with this subject at all, you'll at least recognize the name El. And this was a god, a Canaanite god. For our purposes, I'll probably call El and all the other gods that we talk about besides Yahweh the pagan gods, even though at this time worshippers of Yahweh were pagans themselves. So that monotheistic, worship of Yahweh didn't really happen until later. So, chapter 1. I'm only going to go over the points that I've gone through and highlighted for you guys. I went in last night and reviewed my notes just to make sure that I remembered everything. Anything that I didn't remember or didn't feel kind of pertinent to really talk about, I just left unhighlighted. So now you know. So on page 14, the author contends that El and Yahweh were separate deities and then were later amalgamated. The Old Testament equates El and Yahweh while vehemently opposing Baal, suggesting that there was some sort of favorable judgment of El by worshippers of Yahweh. Page 15 talks about El and says that he was sort of the supreme deity, like the chief god in their pantheon. He was considered a creator god and one possessed of wisdom. Likewise, Yahweh was likely not Canaanite in origin and doesn't appear in the Ugaritic texts. Gracious, my light's going again. Let me readjust again. Okay, we're back. So as we were saying, Yahweh was likely not Canaanite in origin and doesn't appear in the Ugaritic texts, which is something that I'll have to go over in another video some other time because I don't want to give the wrong information and I don't remember everything. So instead of saying something, I will say nothing, but recognize that that is its own big subject. And that's referenced throughout this book as well. The origins of Yahweh likely lie in a land south of Israel, in Midian. There are a lot of epithets for El, the Canaanite or pagan god, in Genesis. A lot of times I think the most common, rather, is the El Shaddai, and quite a few there. Obviously, there's the stele of Merneptah, naming Israel, which is El will rule, and that was in the 13th century BCE. We are moving on to page 17, where El is called the Father of Years versus the Ancient of Days in Daniel. The Father of Years, I guess, derives from Baal. At least, I think that's what this author contends. The epithet, Rider of the Clouds. That'll come up a little bit later, I think. El is considered a god of wisdom. And by page 20, we don't know, if Yahweh was conceived of as a creator god in the very beginning. So that was pretty interesting to me in my, I thought that was interesting. Page 22. The sons of El and the Old Testament Yahweh's heavenly court are kind of the same thing. Like, the sons of El, he had 70 sons, and that heavenly court became Yahweh's heavenly court of angels eventually. Originally, these sons of El were other gods, and when that concept was taken over into the Yahwistic cult, they were demoted to angels. Both Yahweh and El had 70 sons, and El's consort was the goddess Asherah. Okay. We are still on chapter 1. So just a note here, usually I'll read the introduction as well, and I don't have notes on the introduction for this book, which means either the information was just kind of an overview of what the book was going to be, or a lot of acknowledgments and things of, oh, this is why this book came to be, or how this book came to be, that I didn't feel was really relevant to what it was I wanted from that book, which was, the history of the God Yahweh. So, okay. So, on page 26, the prophet Ezekiel, on his reflections of El, are 28, 1 through 10, and then 12 through 19. Let's see. Sit in the seat of God, or gods, in the heart of the seas. This was a reference to El, dwelling at the source of all rivers. So I think this is the verbiage from the book of Ezekiel, and it's saying that they get this idea from El, dwelling at the source of all rivers. There are also themes in Ezekiel of as wise as God, in addition to, looks like a variant of the Garden of Eden story. On page 29, the Garden of Eden, the literal location to the ancients was likely in Armenia. There were 4 headwaters and a mountain. Moving on, page 30 says that the Epic of Gilgamesh underlies the Genesis flood story, and this kind of lines up with something that I'm reading in the book that I'm reading right now, which will be an episode later on with probably, hopefully, better looking notes, but not likely. Page 31, it says El lived at the source of the Euphrates, which is another, heart of the seas, dwelling, in the heart of the seas. Page 32, let me move that up. The Garden of Eden derives from the dwelling place of El. El Shaddai, the mountain one, or of the field, was the preferred name for God until Yahweh was told to Moses. That I thought was pretty cool. So, where were we? Okay, page 34. There are mentions of El, the bull. It's more of a strength symbolism than a fertility one, but both the bull symbolism and the consort Asherah, the goddess, are rejected in the Old Testament. Finally, on this page, you'll see that generally rejected, it's generally rejected rather that the bull represents Baal. Elijah and Elisha didn't mind like them. I assume that means either the bull or Asherah and El, but they hated Baal. Okay, we are almost done with chapter 1 here. So on page 36, hello, let me make that better for you, I'm sorry. So on page 36, there are 6 reasons that the calves are of Yahweh, but are appropriated from El. And that is the end of chapter 1 that we will go over. So we didn't go over the entire chapter, of course. Obviously, as you can see, there are 41 pages in chapter 1 alone, and it's kind of astonishing, actually, because usually 41 pages is a lot, and I feel like I just flew through this book. But, you know, that was over 6 months ago now, so maybe it took me a really long time. Who knows? So chapter 2 is about Yahweh and Asherah, and they go more into like the consort aspect and the mother god idea. So as mentioned in chapter 1, the Old Testament rejected the bull imagery and the idea of Yahweh having a wife. Okay, so further on page 43, Asherah is mentioned 40 times in the Old Testament, sometimes in the plural. So the Ugaritic texts discovered in 1929 validate her as a goddess, and often before this, she's conflated with Astarte. I don't know if that's how you pronounce her name, but that's how I'm going to pronounce her name. Anyway, here are a lot of verses in 1st and 2nd Kings, Chronicles. Is that Judges? Yeah. Anyway, moving on, jumping rather to 53, so jumping 10 pages, quote, "The cult of Asherah disappeared among the Jews as absolute monotheism became solidified." So that makes a lot of sense. Page 56, the lion is a symbol of Asherah. The tree is as well. And the pubic triangle represents fertility. Sorry about this handwriting. This was really small for you. I don't think you'll be able to see it. Page 57 mentions Hosea hang on. How does it go? Verse 14 something 9? I don't remember. Anyway, Hosea 14:9 says Yahweh is uniquely in the Old Testament compared with a tree in the same context as the prophet's condemnation of idols. So somehow within Hosea, Yahweh is kind of compared with that tree symbolism that Asherah is supposedly identified with. We are already on the next page here. Okay, chapter 2 continued. So let's bump up to page 60. Asherah likely functioned as Yahweh's consort. Like the bull symbolism, the Old Testament rejects her and keeps the aged wisdom that they took from El, who, if you'll remember, was mentioned to have been Asherah's, partner. Later on, we're on page 61 now, Asherah was paired with Baal to discredit her. Remember that... okay, there we go. Remember that the Old Testament writers were very much not fans of Baal. Of course, when I read this, I think Baal, but I know the Americanization anyway is Baal, so that's what we'll go with for now. All right. This last note I didn't have highlighted, but I thought it was a neat line anyway. The origin of the personification of wisdom is clearly to be sought elsewhere. So probably they were talking about Asherah, but I didn't highlight it because I couldn't remember who, but I thought it was an interesting idea anyway. So we are now moving on to my favorite chapter, chapter 3, Yahweh versus Baal. So on page 69 it says that the name Baal-zebub was a distorted version of Baal-zebul, or Prince Baal. The Baal cult was the biggest threat to Yahweh worship in ancient Israel. Baal influenced the rain, which was very important in Palestine. They had to rely on their rain for the watering of their crops. And if you remember, earlier on, Baal was said to be the rider of clouds. Page 73, some equated Yahweh and Baal, and you'll see how that kind of comes into play a little bit. Page 79, the name Baal of flies was incorrect. Perhaps they meant Baal of the flame or the illness, but most likely it was a deliberate distortion of the word Zebul, which means prince. So they're kind of doing a lot here to discredit him, and it looks like because, I mean, this is my interpretation of the book I'm reading, but if you had a cult that worshipped Yahweh and wanted Yahweh to kind of be the one true God, and Yahweh kept getting equated with Baal, you'd be pretty eager to make Baal into some separate entity that's somehow bad, right? All right, page 85. Dagon, the father of Baal, was a weather and fertility god, and in the Old Testament he was worshipped by the Philistines and was their chief god. Let's see. He could have been also a god of grain, because originally he was equated with Enlil, a storm god. You'll see down here I've got keywords, and that's something that I've been doing kind of lately in my notes, where I make a keywords line at the very bottom so that I can, have quick reference to the words that I wasn't really familiar with in whatever book I'm reading. Alright, so now we are up to chapter 4. Chapter 3 was wild, you guys, so that level of notes was not representative of the absolute joy that I got out of that chapter. Same with chapter 4. You can see I've only got a couple little notes here. Chapter 4 is called Yahweh's Appropriation of Baal Imagery. And honestly, I think this one is the one that I liked more, but I was reading it while I was walking my dog, and because I was so into it that I was like, well, I don't want to stop reading, but I better walk her before it gets cold and dark out. But anyway, so Yahweh's conflict with the sea, Tiamat, Behemoth, and Leviathan, those are all things that the author contends come from Baal imagery. On page 117, he says that Baal died and rose from the dead. He was buried by the goddess Anat, mourned by her and El, and had a 3-day period before his resurrection, and probably originally it was after a short while for Jesus too. Let's see, it says page 122, not Zoroastrianism, page 126. Don't know what that means. Alright, chapter 5. Yahweh and the goddesses Astarte and Anat. I only have 2 things highlighted here. This chapter I really wasn't too much of a fan of. It was kind of like, I don't know. It was like the Asherah chapter, but not as cool. Maybe I had goddess fatigue by then. On page 148, this is a direct quote, it says, "This strongly suggests that her worship was a popular folk custom. That is, she was a Canaanite goddess and not some recently implanted cult from Assyria," talking about Ishtar, regarding the title Queen of Heaven. On page 150, "The best case can be made for the Queen of Heaven being Astarte." So, for whatever that, whatever theory I had in my head is long gone, but I'll definitely take better notes from here on out. But I found that obviously notable for some reason. So, on to chapter 6, called Yahweh and the Astral Deities, the Sun, Moon, and Lucifer. Page 152, "The Israelites were therefore heirs to a flourishing Canaanite sun cult, so that caution is needed when ascribing later references to Israelite sun worship to Mesopotamian influence." So what they're saying here is that the Israelites were in a place where the Canaanites already had a flourishing sun cult, and even though the idea later on is that the Israelites kind of got sun worship from Mesopotamia, honestly, there's no reason to think that because of this Canaanite sun cult. Moving on to page 153, there is evidence of sun cult presence prior to any likely Mesopotamian influence, and there was a part down here in Josiah, I think it's book 10, verses 12 through 13. I don't know, I have not been to church in a long time. "Yahweh does not equal the sun, but rather the storm." So you can kind of see from this little part here how he might have been equated with Baal, the rider of clouds, the god of rain. Page 158, "The sun more probably equated to Yahweh's court, or the sons of God," what became the angels, a subordinate to Yahweh. In Isaiah book 60, verses 1 and 2, Yahweh transcends the sun. So Yahweh was probably not compared to any solar god of the Canaanites. Probably. Of course, this book is 23 years old now, so who knows? Alright, I only have 2 things highlighted on this one, which means I either don't remember very much or I'm just not into this chapter, but I wrote a lot of notes. So, on page 170, we're still in chapter 6, Baal is called the rider of the clouds, and that's a throne. And his throne is on Mount Zaphon, Zaphon. Elyon, Baal's likely origin of myth, is in Isaiah, book 14, verses 12 through 15. And we are all the way down to chapter 7, Yahweh and the underworld deities. So Mot, Reshaph, Molech, and the Rephaim. I don't know how to pronounce any of this. Anyway, page 187 says that Baal is compared to a lamb, quote-unquote, in my mouth. We're just going to turn the page now. Okay. Here we are. Page 197, Mot was a deity of the underworld of some kind. And Mot's destruction provides a model for Moses' golden calf. The author kind of rejects this parallel, though, and I obviously didn't want to write an entire argument about why they reject the parallel, but it's on page 197 if you're interested. Page 217, so I'm skipping like 20 pages. Molech's child sacrifices cannot be equated with Yahweh's firstborns. This was a huge point for me, because you'll often see, like in on the atheism subreddit, like they talk about, well, you sacrificed all those children during, that story in Egypt and whatever. What is it called? Moses' story about the Pharaoh. And he gives you kind of an explanation of why. So if Molech's child sacrifices cannot be equated with Yahweh's, sacrificed firstborns, this is why. The first reason is that it was only the firstborn boys that Yahweh sacrificed. Molech will take both girls and boys, no matter what the birth order. The second is that only the firstborn goes to Yahweh. Molech was generally all children at all birth orders, so I kind of combined that with point one, pardon me. Moving on to page 224. Rephaim, probably, as Old Testament underworld inhabitants or pre-Israelite population of Canaan. I'll just read this entire thing because I'm not sure what... I have the words in my head, but there's no relation between the usages. The author thinks that there is. So this was a suggestion that the Rephaim were the underworld inhabitants, at least in the Old Testament, or the pre-Israelite population of Canaan. So it could be one or the other. This could be something that is the dead spirits, or just the population of Canaan pre-Israelite. First, the first reason that he gives for this idea is that the ethnic Rephaim are from Ashtaroth, the seat of the underworld. The second is that Ashtaroth, the seat of God, I don't know what that is. In the Ugaritic texts, Molech in the Old Testament. So that's a name of a god. I remember seeing this last night and being like, oh, I better not mess that up. His seat is in Hinnom, where sacrifices are burned alive. The valley of Hinnom joins the valley of Rephaim. So that's just a little theory that the author has that doesn't really have a lot of practical, use for the lay person like me. But anyway, let's move right on along to chapter 8. I'm going to try to underline it, but it doesn't want to underline. Conclusion. Canaanite deities and the rise of monotheism. So on page 227 it says, absolute monotheism seems to have been predominant in the post-exilic period. So after the exile of Israelites in Babylon, absolute monotheism kind of became predominant then. J.H. Tigay, suggests worship of other gods is rare, and names with the Yahweh sound are 16 times more common than the pagan names. We'll get to that a little bit later, but the reasons for this was that the worshippers saw Yahweh as the most important in the pantheon. I think these are Tigay's reasons. And two, the names of female deities hardly occur in the Ugaritic personal names. So in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, in Judah, Asherah was worshipped, but people didn't really name their daughters after her, or any kids, really. Whereas, he says that it's 16 times more common than a pagan-derived name for the names of children. Okay. The third reason that Tigay gives is that geographical and temporal limitations of the epigraphic material collected by Tigay should be noted. So we don't have a great pool of candidates from his evidence, so that's just a note that the author wanted to make. And the fourth reason, finally, Graham Davies notes that Tigay's tendency to overestimate the number of Yahwistic names, and probably it's more like 10 to 1 rather than 16 to 1. So, that is a big you know, change 16 versus 10, but it's still quite a lot. All right. So A.P. Hayman claims that absolute monotheism was achieved only by the Middle Ages. The author has an argument here. Let me see what it says. He argues for monolatrous party already in pre-exilic period. So they already were pretty there was already a monotheistic, I think, cult in the pre-exile, but not dominant, not as dominant as Tegay says, and absolute monotheism fully operative after the exile. Page 231, Gorsh. Josiah's reforms were not fully historical, but religious reform could have taken place during his reign. Page 232, the purge of Judah and Jerusalem of idolatry at his 12th year of his reign, probably came before the discovery of the law book in Josiah's 18th regnal year. So that's interesting. I always thought that the purging of the idolatry in Judah and Jerusalem happened because he found the law book, but that's kind of a cool idea too. Page 233, Josiah's removed cults were Canaanite deities. Quote-unquote, the 70 sons of God were originally El's pantheon, demoted to angels, and Baal the prince became Beelzebul. 234. The chaos monster and the seven-headed Leviathan in Canaanite mythology became the seven-headed dragon, or Satan of Revelation 12, my goodness, and the seven-headed beast of Rome in Revelation 13. The resurrection of the dead derives from Baal. He was, a rain and fertility god. So every year he would die and go into the underworld. And then when spring would come, he would be resurrected and come back. Monotheism, rather than God's mighty works, is what distinguished the Old Testament from other religions in the ancient Near East. So the main theme of this book, the main lesson that I took from this book, is this particular line right here. Monotheism rather than God's mighty works. So people would obviously compare Yahweh to Baal, to El, to other sorts of gods. And when you're talking about it, it's kind of like when you're a little kid at a playground and saying, like, well, my dad's stronger than your dad. Well, that's sort of similarly what happened here. The god of rain, Baal, would be, in charge of the rain. And the Yahwists would say, well, our God is the God of rain, but he's also the God of the sun, and he's also the God of wisdom, and he's also the God of birth and death, and what have you. So that's kind of how the Yahwist cult kind of took off. Like, because he was in charge of everything, rather than there's an entire pantheon of gods that could become displeased with you, and, you have to make a sacrifice at each altar. Well, it's probably a lot easier to go with the one guy who takes care of absolutely everything. I don't know. Makes sense to me. So I imagine that people probably want a kind of smash or pass in book speak. I would say smash, I suppose. It's a short read, and it was informative and obviously much more nuanced and detailed than what my review certainly is. But definitely chapters 3 and 4 are the best ones for me. Those are the easiest ones to really dive into. And so, yeah, for that I say smash, and that's the book Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan. So thanks for joining me for that, and I will see you for the next book, whenever that happens to be. Thank you. Goodbye.